Good evening and welcome to the Redwood Library in Athenæum. My name is Benedict Lecca, your friendly director librarian, speaking to you from Newport, Rhode Island. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome back the ever-popular Music Appreciation Series with Dr. Edward Markward. And we thank our generous sponsors of the series, the Jarzembek family, Mark Jarzembek and Michelle Drum. Tonight, Dr. Markward will be presenting the Nationalists continued. And that would be the three musicians that he'll be treating tonight, Zoltán, Kodály, and Béla Bartók. All right, so welcome everyone, and Dr. Markward, take it away.
Thank you, Benedict, and welcome everyone. First thing we should do is learn how to pronounce Zoltán Kodály. Benedict spelled it correctly. It's K-O-D-A with an accent L-Y. And Mr. Kodály lived from 1882 to 1967. He wrote some fantastic music, but he's probably remembered in our country mostly for the so-called Kodály method of music education. And we'll also be talking mainly about Béla Bartók, 1881 to 1945, one of the 20th century's giants and one of my very favorite composers. I want to share with you before we begin a short, cute, I think, story. The Kronos Quartet, which many of you probably have heard of or maybe even heard play, it specializes in presentation of 20th century music, was performing a concert at Brown University, and two of my friends were sitting in front of two people discussing the program behind my friends. And one said to the other, "I don't recognize any names on this program except Bartók, and I hate Bartók." I'm hopeful we can change your minds if you've come in slightly skeptical about these two composers. They were both Hungarian, and therefore I'm treating them as nationalists, and even more so than some others that we've talked about as nationalistic composers, such as Sibelius, Dvorak, Smetana, and so forth, in that, pardon me, Kodály and Bartók shared an interest in peasant or folk music, and indeed traveled around Hungary and its environs, collecting these songs and using them as models for their classical music. Kodály spent some time, about 7 years, in a portion of Hungary called Galanta. It batted back and forth between Czechoslovakia and Hungary, depending on which side was winning in which war. He immortalized this place, this region, in the orchestral dances based on folk music from the area. From a young age, Kodály was already composing from the age of 5 or so he's sort of a Mozart of the modern age. He enrolled at the Academy of Music in 1906 and completed a PhD with a thesis entitled The Strophic Structure of Hungarian Folk Songs. That's all we're going to talk about in that vein right now. His interest in Hungarian folk songs, he made trips to the Hungarian countryside where he collected these songs, as I mentioned, with his close friend, Béla Bartók. And in 1951, a comprehensive critical edition of Hungarian folk songs was published with hundreds and hundreds of these songs. Outside of Hungary, Kodály's compositions began to make their way in the repertoire around 1908 or 1910 in that area, and they became known widely because of concerts that he and Béla Bartók presented together of their own music. In 1923, Kodály was commissioned to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Union of Buda and Pest, and he wrote one of his most famous works at this young age, the Psalmus Hungaricus, which is a translation of Psalm 55 into Hungarian by a 16th century poet. It's a very powerful setting of this psalm, which begins, "Give ear to my prayer, O God." It's a psalm of David, of course. And Kodály chose the sacred text for this secular occasion for a very good reason. The libretto's passages of despair and a call to God provide opportunities for the composer to address Hungary's tragic and disastrous past, especially after the Treaty of Trianon, which is part of the Treaty of Paris, in 1920, during which Hungary lost over 70% of its national territory. The music reflects, therefore, the nation's crisis during and after the war. It is in 8 movements, it's in 4 movements, and we'll start with the first movement, and here is the text for that first movement. When great King David, sorely afflicted even by friends, abused and ill-treated, bitterly cried his heart's desolation, then he began to pray to the Lord God. This particular part is sung by the chorus. Here's part 1 of Psalmus Hungaricus by Zoltán Kodály. I want to mention one thing. You hear that theme that goes from a higher pitch to a lower pitch. This is a device that has been around since the Renaissance time, called the doctrine of affectations, and there's no reason the 20th century or 21st century composers can't use it. It's a sighing motive, and I think you can feel in this orchestration, and then when the chorus comes in, this same sort of motive is used, and I think you can feel the anguish contained therein. And then the tenor takes up the music with this text. O God, my Lord, I pray thee to hear me. Turn back thine eyes upon me, thy servant. Leave me no longer in my bereftness. My heart within me weeps deepest anguish. And I think this tenor portrays that anguish as well as any. Sighing figure, 2 notes downward.
Fordítsad reám szent szemeidet, nagy szükségemben, ne hagyd engemet, mert megemészni, hagy állod szívemet.
Falling second motive. And then the tenor continues with the text that we probably all know. Had I but wings, a dove's or an eagle's, I would have flown away from my troubles. Far from the tempest, I would take shelter, flee from my foes, and rest in the deep desert. This is a more lyric part of the piece. It's very lyric, and the tenor sings the solo. Clearly, we have to have harps for the wings of the dove or of an eagle. As you can hear, it's very lyric and wonderfully expresses the text, had I but the wings of a dove. Next, I'd like to turn to an orchestral piece called The Dances of Galanta, which, as you recall, I mentioned earlier, was an area of Hungary that Kodály inhabited early in his life. He uses some folk tunes in these pieces, and it presents an authentic Hungarian national idiom in a manner that allowed it international prominence. It's one of his most performed works. The piece was commissioned by the Budapest Philharmonic on the 80th anniversary of its founding. And as I say, it's based on the folk music of Galanta. And here is a bit of it. It's a one-movement piece. This is based on some of the folk songs. I think you can hear some of the folk-like quality to these melodies and the rhythms that Kodály uses. Modern scholars are rather split on whether this kind of usage of the peasant or folk song is actually related to the Romani or the Gypsy songs that we know. I'm going to try to play a portion of it where that might be true. To me, it sounds a bit like a klezmer band, except on a very large scale. And so on. I think it's a fantastic piece. If you're a violinist, you probably have to woodshed a little bit, Karen? But these fast passage work for the violins and the woodwinds is not only indicative throughout Kodály's music, but it's also going to be indicative of some of Bartók's greatest pieces as well. One further piece of Kodály I'd like to examine with you is the Missa Brevis, written in 1942 to 1944. As we know, Bartók fled the Nazis in 1940 and moved to the United States, to New York. Kodály remained behind in Budapest, and he hid out in the opera house in the cellar, which is where he wrote the Missa Brevis. And it had its first performance in 1945, after the Nazis had left, run out by the Soviet army. The first performance was actually given in the cloakroom of the opera house. And it's actually also a reworking of the 1942 piece for organ and chorus and soloists. In that regard, it sort of resembles the Fauré and the Duruflé Requia, which both began as pieces for chorus, soloist, and organ. I want to play a bit here of the Sanctus, and you will note that the instruments first introduce the main theme. It's a stepwise upward theme, followed by a leap, and then as the chorus comes in, they will sing it as well. Those are the same three pitches used in the Idée fixe of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, for those of you who are counting at home. I want to do that again for one reason. I think there's something absolutely heartwarming and charming. By the way, this is the Budapest or the Hungarian National Philharmonic and Chorus, conducted by Zoltán Kodály. I think it's absolutely charming and heartwarming the way the Slavic choirs often slide from pitch to pitch. I think it's authentic, and I think it adds a depth to the soul searching that is going on here in the Sanctus, Holy, 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 Lord God of Sabaoth. I'm going to move it to the chorus. That, of course, is just my opinion. As I mentioned earlier, Kodály probably is more famous, pardon me, in our country as the founder of the Kodály method of music education. He was very interested in the problems of music education in his own country, and although he did not actually devise this method, his philosophy lent inspiration for the method to his followers. I think it's interesting in this day and age when less and less and less importance is placed on the arts and our humanity. Kodály insisted that the music education system needed better teachers, better curriculum, and more class time devoted to music. Hear, hear. We now move to Béla Bartók, the more famous of the two, I'm sure, who lived from 1881 to 1945, died tragically at a not too ripe old age, a of leukemia. He was a virtuoso pianist, a piano teacher, and like Kodály, he was an ethnomusicologist who specialized in, as we have already learned, the folk music of his native Hungary. His parents were amateur musicians, and he studied piano and composition at the Hungarian Royal Academy of Music. But in 1934, he entered the Academy of Sciences and became an ethnomusicologist, that is, the study of music in its social and cultural context or ramification. In 1938, after the Nazi takeover of Austria, he sent all of his manuscripts to the United States, and in 1940, he emigrated to New York City along with his family. You've probably heard some of his more famous works: the opera Bluebeard's Castle, the pantomime ballet The Miraculous Mandarin, the dance suite, the concerto for orchestra, which we'll look at in depth tonight, music for strings, percussion, and celesta, 3 piano concertos, 2 violin concertos, 6 string quartets, 2 violin sonatas, a piano sonata, and this, interestingly, the Mikrokosmos for piano, which is a book comprised of 153 piano pieces, moving from easy to more difficult as you move through the book. He achieved his distinctive personal style around 1908 with his first string quartet and Bluebeard's Castle in 1911. I'm going to play you an example of a piece from 1911 as well. And it's sort of a curiosity because it's a piano work called Allegro Barbaro. And almost every piano teacher of college students ultimately assigns this to the students. This particular recording is of great interest because it's part of a CD that, not that there were CDs, but it's Béla Bartók actually playing the piano. As you can see here, and we'll see in successive works of Bartók's, especially in the next piece, the music for strings, percussion, and celesta, which was written in 1936, Bartók treats the piano as part of the percussion section. And I think it's self-explanatory in that Allegro Barbaro. There are not too many whistleable tunes there. And typical also of Bartók is that the motivic material or the themes are rather short. Both Kodály and Bartók can be considered tonal composers, although Bartók especially used dissonance, and again, most especially in his earlier works. We find, as we have with other composers, the stridency, the dissonance, the avant-garde was soon left for something even more palatable for a general wide audience. One of his last pieces, the Concerto for Orchestra, which we'll get to in a little bit, pardon me, is one of the most accessible pieces that he wrote or composed, and it was premiered by the Boston Symphony in 1944, a year before his death. Bartók, like Kodály, synthesized peasant or folk music with classical forms, and he used both traditions. There's a single pitch center to every movement that he wrote, much like Haydn or Mozart, except the route to get to that pitch center at cadences is not the traditional route. He, like Stravinsky, invented scales, like Debussy invented scales. And so we find our way traveling paths and not knowing where they will come to until we get there. But we know we have arrived because he makes it so logical to get there. You will find in Bartók a great rhythmic complexity. And of course, he mixes all kinds of traditions, folk, peasant, Romani, if you will, and classical. The piece we're going to listen to now, or part of it, is music for percussion, or for strings, percussion, and celesta. And again, we will find that the piano is used primarily in this work as a percussion instrument. I'm not sure that's audible. I'm going to move it ahead. Not a hint of what's to come, but here is even more typical Bartók in the second movement. Listen to the very difficult and fast passage work. He uses this almost continuously in all of his music that is at least at the allegro level. Very short motives and lots of rapid passage work. Flying string playing. The piece was written in 1936. Let's give a listen a bit to the slow movement. By the way, this recording is the LA Philharmonic with Esa-Pekka Salonen. And while I think of it, if you go on YouTube and type Salonen or Esa-Pekka Salonen, if you know the name, and Bartók, there are 2 8 or 10 minute clips in which Maestro Salonen talks about Bartók one of them about the music and the big pieces, and the other about Bartók's rather sad days toward the end of his life in noisy New York City, where he lived for toward the end of his life. Notice how he does come back to certain, what we would call tonal centers, and then expands in that particular area, moves on to another one, and ultimately comes back to the original. We're going to move on now to the Concerto for Orchestra. Bartók was living in New York City, as I said, with his family from 1940 until his death in 1945. He was poverty-stricken, at a loss for finances, and compounded by his undiagnosed condition of having leukemia. Two friends of his, two native Hungarians also, Joseph Szigeti, the great violinist, and Fritz Reiner, the conductor of the Chicago Symphony, went to Serge Koussevitzky, the conductor of the Boston Symphony, prevailed upon Maestro Koussevitzky to visit Bartók at his hospital bed, and offer him a commission to write a piece that would show off the Boston Symphony. Thus, the birth of the Concerto for Orchestra, completed in 1943. It only took Bartók 2 months to write this absolute monument of 20th century music. He wrote it from the 15th of August until the middle of October. And as I said, it was premiered on December 1, 1944 by the Boston Symphony to rave reviews conducted by the aforementioned Serge Koussevitzky. The funny thing is that it's called a concerto for orchestra rather than a symphony. And Bartók explained it this way, because it does seem contradictory, does it not? Bartók said that he called the piece a concerto rather than a symphony because of the way each section of instruments is treated in a soloistic and virtuosic way. Every movement has some sort of a canon or fugue. So we can say he's gone back and used traditional forms that were with us since J.S. Bach and then later Haydn and Mozart, but cast in the 20th century idiom. And as we know, in this case, and the case of Kodály also, based somewhat on folk music of Hungary. I'm going to play the introduction. It's Andante non troppo, and then it's followed by Allegro vivace. Bass and cello, the gateway to a marvelous half hour or so. Shimmering violins above, very mysterious, eerie sounding. Opening theme. Expansion of the opening theme. Fuller orchestra, all the strings. Home bass. Let's move on. Notice the soloistic nature of the instruments, hence concerto for orchestra. It passes the themes around from one section to the next. The next movement, which is a favorite of many people, it's the presentation, literally, the presentando le coppie, the presentation of the couples. And you'll hear as the instruments are presented in this movement, they do the thematic material in pairs. Starting with bassoons. Oboes in pairs. To flutes. The next movement is called Elegy or Elegia. It's an andante non troppo, and it starts with the same two pitches that the introduction began with, except they are inverted or upside down. And again, they begin in the low strings, followed by a wonderful oboe solo, and we'll listen to as much of it as we can. I want you to get a sampling of all the movements. It's such a fantastic piece of music. Down instead of up. Very eerie-like and shows the influence of Debussy. Bartók was influenced by Debussy and also by Stravinsky, which we'll see in a few minutes. Notice he changed keys. And again. The next movement is called intermezzo interrotto, or interrupted intermezzo. And we have a lilting, limping rhythm, I think you'll find. And it's because he alternates between 2/4 and 5/8. So it's dee da dee da dee da da dee da dee da dee da da. And he passes this wonderful limping tune around from section to section, and finally with the full strings. It's coming. A couple more items before we get to the finale. He did write after this work a solo violin sonata completed in 1944, and all but the last measures of the Piano Concerto No. 3 in 1945, which was written for his wife. And he wrote, as I believe I mentioned, 3 piano concerti, and this is the most lyric of all. And I think it's filled with the affection, if one can do that in musical terms, that he felt for his wife. It's not as knotty as the first 2 or as difficult for both the orchestra and the pianist. And then when he died of leukemia, his last composition that he was working on was a viola concerto. It was left uncompleted, but he left a whole ream of sketches behind, and it was completed by Tibor Surly in 1945 and is indeed part of the repertoire now. We come to the finale, which is a presto. It's a typical Bartók busy string work filled with syncopation, and it raises you right out of your seat, whether you're conducting it, playing it, or listening to it. I hope I'm going to end with this. Not I hope I'm going to end with this. I am going to end with this, but I hope that you have come away with an appreciation for how approachable these 2 Hungarian composers are, and are not really anything to be afraid of. The finale to the Concerto for Orchestra is simply fantastic. So I leave you with that. We begin again in September on the 22nd, and we're going to do sort of a mix in the fall and in the spring especially. In the fall, I'm going to deal with masterpieces. The first will be the B minor Mass of J.S. Bach, the Brahms and a German Requiem. And then I'm going to do a spiritual journey of Leonard Bernstein in November, and J.S. Bach's Christmas Oratorio, so-called, in December. Beginning in January 2022 is the 275th anniversary of the founding of the Redwood Library. So we're going to spend an awful lot of time on Americana, beginning back with William Billings, a colonial composer who incidentally was born in 1746, 1 year before the founding of the great Redwood Library in Athenæum. So I hope to see you then, and we're going to go out, as I say, with the last movement of the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra. Karen Jackson Geary, have you played this incredibly difficult piece? I'll bet. Fugue. Rather, canon at the measure. I share with you at this moment that my high school friend, Paul Hemmer, who is famous in the Midwest, is here attending from Dubuque, Iowa. Paul, welcome and thank you. We had some great times making music together through our college years. To get in under the wire, I'm moving ahead. And the audience leapt to its collective feet. Thank you all for joining. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Markward, as always, enlightening. I want to thank you very much, and also for just the consistency with which you are really kind of enlightening us and leading us through the thicket. I hope that all of you will join us not next Thursday. It's September 2nd for another concert on the Big Chair presented on the Redwood grounds. It will be Kurt Ram Trio, a lively jazz group. Thank you, Dr. Markward. I want to thank you very much for another enlightening talk. I want to thank everyone this evening that joined us, and I want to encourage you to join us on Thursday, September 2nd for another concert on the Big Chair presented on the Redwood grounds. It'll be Kurt Ram Trio, a very lively jazz quattro, in fact. We encourage you to bring a blanket and a picnic, and just please visit our website to register. If you are not a Redwood member, time's now to make the leap. And keep in mind, of course, that this lecture, as all of the others, will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And should you go there to watch this event again, please do sign up as a subscriber. That would be very helpful to us. So I want to thank our speaker, Dr. Markward, and all of you this evening. Thank you very much, and have a great evening. Thank you so much.